Picture this. America, 1947. It's the middle of the night. You wake up because something feels wrong. The air in your bedroom is heavier than it should be, sharp enough to make you pull the blanket tighter without thinking. You listen for the familiar sound, the low hum of the furnace cycling on. It never comes. You get up and walk through the house. The floor is cold under your feet. The walls feel different. The silence feels permanent. Outside there is some snow, but no fallen trees, no disaster unfolding in the streets. The power is still on. The lights still work. But the heat, the thing that makes a house livable, is gone. And as the hours pass, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. No truck is coming, no delivery is late, no repair is scheduled. This isn't a breakdown, it's a shortage. In the winter of 1947, millions of Americans were about to discover that victory abroad didn't guarantee warmth at home. Just 2 years after winning the most destructive war in human history, the world's most powerful nation discovered something terrifying. Modern life could still fail quietly. Homes didn't collapse, cities didn't burn. Life simply narrowed. The winter of 1947, when America ran out of heat. The year 1947 was supposed to be a year of celebration. The war was over. The boys had come home. Factories that had built tanks and bombers were now producing refrigerators and automobiles. America was the most powerful nation on earth, and its people believed they had earned the right to be comfortable. The economy was booming. Jobs were plentiful. Young couples were buying houses in new suburbs, filling them with children and appliances, and all the promises of peacetime prosperity. If you had asked an American in the autumn of 1946 what they feared most, they might have said another war. They might have said the atomic bomb. Nobody would have said coal. Nobody would have said heating oil, because those things were invisible. You didn't think about where your heat came from any more than you thought about where the air came from. You just expected it to be there, and for years it always had been. But by the time the leaves fell in the autumn of 1947, something was already wrong. The signs were there for anyone paying attention. Coal stockpiles were lower than they should have been. Heating oil reserves were thin. The war had disrupted everything: production, transportation, labor, and the country was still catching up. In November, the government issued warnings. Insulate your homes. Close the registers in rooms you don't need. Conserve fuel. Most people ignored the advice. Then winter arrived, and winter arrived hard. The cold came down from Canada in waves. It settled over the Great Plains first, then pushed east. Temperatures dropped well below normal. Snow piled up in the Midwest and the West. The kind of cold that makes pipes burst and cars refuse to start. But this wasn't just about cold weather. Cold weather was something America knew how to handle. People had been surviving winters for centuries. This was different. This was about what happens when the system that keeps everyone warm starts to fail. Not because of a storm, not because of an attack, but because there simply isn't enough fuel to go around. And that's a kind of crisis that's hard to see coming, hard to understand even when it's happening. The lights still work, the radio still plays, the streets look normal, but inside the houses, room by room, the cold is winning. The first thing you noticed was the thermostat. You'd set it to 70, like always, but the house never quite got there. 68, 65, then lower. At first, people assumed something was wrong with their furnace. They tapped the gauge on the oil tank. But the furnace was fine. The problem was simpler and worse. There was nothing to burn. In cities across America, fuel deliveries slowed, then stopped. Coal trucks that should have arrived on Monday didn't come until Thursday, then didn't come at all. Heating oil that should have been in the basement tank was somewhere else, stuck in a rail yard, sitting in a refinery, promised to someone who needed it more. The country was running on fumes, and the fumes were running out. A housewife in Ohio stood at her window, watching for a truck that never came. A factory worker in Pennsylvania came home to find his family huddled in the kitchen, the only room they could keep warm. A school teacher in Indiana wore her coat indoors because the classroom radiator had gone cold. Annoyances, things you could complain about to your neighbor, laugh about at the dinner table. But as the days passed and the temperatures didn't rise and the deliveries didn't come, the annoyances became something else. They became fear. Not the sharp fear of an emergency, the slow fear of realizing that no one was coming to fix this, that you were on your own. That fear settled into homes across America, and it didn't leave for months. To understand what happened in 1947, you have to understand what coal meant to America. Today, we think of coal as dirty, obsolete, something from another era. But in 1947, coal was everything. Coal heated the homes. Coal generated the electricity. Coal moved the trains that moved the goods that kept the economy alive. Cut off the supply, and everything starts to fail. And the supply was being cut off, not by sabotage, not by foreign enemies, by 100 small problems that added up to one enormous crisis. The war had drained the coal industry. Miners had gone to fight. Equipment had been neglected. Production had been diverted to the military, to the Allies, to 100 urgent needs that pushed domestic stockpiles to the bottom of the list. When the war ended, everyone assumed things would snap back to normal. They didn't. Labor disputes slowed the mines. Strikes disrupted production. Railroads struggled to move the coal that was being mined. And the harsh winter meant everyone needed more fuel at exactly the moment there was less to go around. The mathematics were brutal. You can't burn coal that doesn't exist. You can't deliver oil that isn't there. You can't heat a home with promises. And so, across the country, homes grew colder. The crisis didn't announce itself with headlines at first. It crept into daily life through small indignities. Thermostats turned down another degree, then another. Families that had used the whole house retreated to fewer rooms. The parlor was closed off. The spare bedroom was abandoned. Everyone gathered in the kitchen near the stove, the warmest spot in the house. People wore more clothes indoors. Sweaters over shirts, coats over sweaters, hats at the dinner table. It would have seemed absurd a year earlier. Now it was just Tuesday. Children did their homework in mittens. Mothers cooked with their coats on. Fathers came home from work to houses that felt like the outdoors had leaked inside. And everywhere, people waited, watched the street for the truck, listened for the sound of a delivery, hoped that tomorrow would be better. One person said, "This was so interesting to see. What I remember about that year, I was 14 years old, and my dad and I took our big truck to Bayard to get groceries. I couldn't believe all the snow, something to behold." The memories from that winter stayed with people for decades. The snow, the cold, the strange feeling of abundance and scarcity existing side by side, because that was the paradox of 1947. America was rich. America was powerful. America had more of everything than any nation in history, except the one thing everyone needed most: heat. By late January, the crisis could no longer be ignored. Schools began to close, not because of snow days, the cheerful disruption that children loved, but because the buildings couldn't be heated. Classrooms sat empty, radiators cold, while students stayed home in houses that weren't much warmer. Factories cut shifts, not because there wasn't work to do, but because there wasn't enough fuel to keep the machinery running and the workers warm. Men who had jobs found themselves idle, sent home to conserve resources. In some cities, authorities ordered dime-outs, not blackouts like during the war when enemy bombers might be overhead, but dime-outs, reducing electricity to save the coal that generated it. Streetlights went dark, neon signs flickered off. Cities that had blazed with post-war optimism grew dim and quiet. It felt like going backward, like the war hadn't really ended, like the sacrifices were starting all over again. And for many Americans, that was the hardest part. Not the cold itself, but what the cold meant. They had done everything right. They had worked and saved and sent their sons to fight. They had won. They had earned comfort and security and a future without rationing and shortages. And now they were sitting in cold houses, wearing coats indoors, wondering if the fuel truck would come tomorrow. The government tried to respond. Emergency measures were announced. Coal was redirected from some uses to others. Priorities were established. Hospitals first. Essential industries second. Homes somewhere down the list. Officials went on the radio and asked for patience, asked for sacrifice, asked people to turn down their thermostats, close off rooms, do more with less. The appeals sounded familiar. Too familiar. They sounded like the war, and people listened. Mostly, they didn't have much choice. But there was anger, too. Questions about why the greatest nation on earth couldn't keep its citizens warm, about who was responsible, about whether the shortage was real or manufactured, natural or artificial. Some blamed the coal companies, some blamed the unions, some blamed the government, some blamed the railroads. Everyone blamed someone. But blame didn't make the houses warmer, and the coal didn't care about politics. What the winter of 1947 revealed was something Americans didn't want to see. The country was vulnerable, not to bombs or invasion, not to the enemies they had just defeated, but to the quiet failure of systems everyone depended on and nobody understood. Coal wasn't glamorous. Heating oil wasn't exciting. The supply chains that kept fuel moving from mines to homes were invisible, taken for granted, assumed to work. Until they didn't. And when they failed, there was nothing to do but endure. That's the thing about a fuel shortage. You can't fight it. You can't organize against it. You can't rally or resist. You can only wait and stay warm however you can. Families gathered in single rooms, closing off the rest of the house. They hung blankets over doorways to trap what little heat they had. They boiled water on stoves just to add some warmth to the air. Churches and community centers opened their doors as warming stations. Neighbors checked on neighbors. People who had coal shared with people who didn't. The same spirit that had gotten America through the Depression, through the war, showed itself again, quietly, without fanfare. Just people helping people because that's what you did. An old woman in a cold apartment, a young mother with a baby to keep warm, a family of 6 in a 3-room house with barely enough fuel to heat one. They made it work. They always made it work. But they shouldn't have had to. That was the bitter truth underneath all the endurance and community spirit. This wasn't a natural disaster. This wasn't an act of God. This was a failure of planning, of foresight, of the systems that were supposed to protect people. And everyone knew it. The winter didn't last forever. They never do. By March, the temperatures began to rise. The crisis eased. Coal started moving again. Oil deliveries resumed. The houses warmed up, degree by painful degree. Life returned to something like normal. But the memory didn't fade. The people who lived through the winter of 1947 carried it with them. Not as a dramatic story of survival, not as a tale of heroism, but as a quiet lesson about how fragile comfort really is. They became the parents and grandparents who never let the oil tank drop below half, who kept extra blankets in the closet, who checked the furnace every autumn and worried every time a cold snap came through. They knew what it felt like when the heat didn't come, and they never wanted to feel it again. The winter of 1947 changed how America thought about energy. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. In the years that followed, the country diversified. Natural gas became more important. Oil heating expanded. The dependency on coal began a long, slow decline that would take decades to complete. New regulations emerged. New stockpile requirements, new systems for managing supply and demand. The chaos of 1947 became a case study in what not to do, but the deeper lesson was harder to institutionalize, the lesson that modern life is built on invisible foundations, that the things we take for granted, heat, light, power, are the products of vast systems we don't see and barely understand, that those systems can fail, and when they do, there's nothing to do but endure. We learned that lesson in 1947. Then we forgot it. Then we learned it again in different ways, in different crises, in different winters. And we'll probably learn it again, because that's how it works. Comfort makes us complacent. Prosperity makes us assume tomorrow will be like today. And then something fails, quietly, without warning, and we remember what our grandparents knew all along. Nothing is guaranteed. The winter of 1947 wasn't the coldest winter in American history. It wasn't the deadliest. It didn't produce the most dramatic photographs or the most memorable headlines. But it might have been the most humbling, because it showed a nation at the peak of its power that power has limits, that victory in war doesn't mean victory over nature, that all the factories and all the money and all the confidence in the world can't keep you warm if the cold doesn't come. Somewhere in America, right now, there's an old house with a furnace in the basement. The furnace kicks on automatically when the temperature drops. The oil truck comes every few weeks without being called. The whole system works without anyone thinking about it. And somewhere in that house, there might be an old photograph, a family portrait from the late 1940s. Everyone dressed in their Sunday best, smiling for the camera. If you could ask them about that winter, the winter when the heat ran out, they'd remember. They'd tell you about the cold floors and the closed-off rooms, about wearing coats at the dinner table, about waiting for a truck that never came. And they'd tell you something else too, something quieter. They'd tell you they got through it, not because they were heroes, not because they did anything special, but because they did what people have always done when times get hard. They held on, they helped each other, they made do. And when the spring finally came, they never forgot what winter taught them. The winter of 1947, when the lights stayed on, when the radios played, when everything looked normal, but the houses grew cold. And America learned, for a little while at least, that the things we depend on most are the things we notice least, until they're gone. If your parents or grandparents lived through the winter of 1947, ask them about it. Those memories are fading now, held by fewer people every year. But the lesson remains. We are always closer to the cold than we think. Thanks for watching and being part of this channel. I create this channel to bring these memories. If you'd like to support it through Super Thanks, I truly appreciate it. Your likes, comments, and shared memories mean just as much. Thank you for being here.